because a lot of people ask me to do lessons on this and how to play using the alto scale and where it's used and stuff like that. So the alto scale, if you don't know, it's the 7th mode of the melodic minor scale, and a lot of people talk about how difficult it is and that it's very complicated and all, and in fact it's not that difficult. I mean, it's a scale, you play it on a chord, it's 7 notes like any other scale. The problem some people might have with making music with it is because they don't understand the chord. A lot of the time when we practice chords, we just sort of take, well, okay, we're gonna take this this chord and then we're just gonna loop it and play on it using the scale till we get used to it and figure out like what can we play on it, what arpeggios, what triads, etc., etc. But this approach with the alto scale, I mean, you can do it, but the point is, when you're playing an altered chord, is that you're making a sort of statement, that you're trying to play something that sticks out a bit, and that means that all the notes want to sound dissonant, and they need to resolve. So if you keep that in mind when you practice it, then you're probably better off making music with it. For instance, if I play a cadence in C using an altered dominant, so D minor 7, G7 altered, C major 7, then the note that makes this an altered dominant is this note, the E flat, and we use that just to create a bit more tension on the dominant. We could, if I didn't play an E flat but a normal 13, then you don't have that tension. So to me it always made more sense to just look at the notes and go, well, for this note in the alto scale, it needs to go to this note on the chord that it resolves to, which gives every note on the alto scale a sort of purpose, and which also makes it easier for me to make lines that connect well and resolve well to the following chord, because 99% of the time altered dominants are resolving. It's not very often that you just have an altered chord standing on its own. So let's just look at that. The first thing we should have then is just a way of playing the alto scale for this lesson. So you can do that like this. And as I mentioned, the alto scale is the 7th mode of the melodic minor scale. So in fact, this is the melodic minor scale, the A flat melodic minor scale. Then what we could look at, so what I talked about was that all the notes in the alto scale wants to resolve, and of course this is G7 altered, so it wants to resolve to a C major, or at least a C chord, but in this case I'm just going to resolve it to C major. And for each note in the scale, it wants to go somewhere. So if we look at it like that, the first note in the scale that I took is now the flat 9, the A flat. So which wants to resolve to the G. The next note would be a B flat, so if I play and the B flat, you can actually resolve it to the major 7 of the C major 7 chord, or you can resolve it even through the flat 9 or directly. The next note we get is the B, so, and I would say that just stays there on the C major 7, or you resolve it to the root, but it does sound a bit final. Okay, the next note, the D flat, which resolves to a D. E flat, which you can resolve to, well, you can move it up to an E, or you can move it down to a D. The F, which wants to go down to E, or you could also resolve it to a G. And then the last note, which is just the G, and actually the G doesn't really resolve at all, because it is already resolved, since it's a chord note in both chords. So if you think of the notes like that, you can sort of hear where they want to go, and that means that when you're making a line on an altered chord, you also know where you want to have that line end, because the last note needs to be dealt with in the right way. And most of the time, the resolutions that I just demonstrated are the most smooth way to do that. You can use bigger intervals when you resolve stuff, but it's a bit more difficult. So if we use this, we can actually make the simplest 2-5-1 licks with altered dominants known to man. Which is my example 4, which is just a few examples of those. So if we play one note on the D minor, and one note on the G7, or another one, and you could use that as a framework for building lines. So what I'm doing is just that I'm playing, starting on that note, and really trying to just make something up in between, and resolving it. So those simple 3-note altered 2-5-1 licks can be used as a starting point for making lines. So of course, when you need to make your own 2-5-1 lines, and you need to make your own lines on the altered dominant, you need some material to make those lines with. And if you play through the different diatonic chords in A-flat melodic minor or in G7 altered, you'll notice that there's not a G7 in there, because the G7 is not strictly a diatonic chord to A-flat melodic minor. So the way you need to approach that is to find some other chords that will work as arpeggios. I think I talked a bit about this in one of the lessons on diatonic arpeggios, so I'll just put a link to it in the video now. And then, so two arpeggios that I use really a lot on altered dominants would be in this case, so for the G7, would be the arpeggio from the F, so that's an F half diminished. Because it has the sound of the dominant and some good alterations, and the same goes for the what is that? That's a B major 7 flat 5 arpeggio. Again, you have sort of the essence of the chord in the B and the F, and then you have two other notes that will just color it nicely, and get a good sound of that G7 altered. So you might want to practice those. I mean, anyway, you probably want to practice all your diatonic arpeggios in melodic minor if you want to improvise with it and know what's going on. But those two are especially handy for this altered dominant sound. Okay, so let's try and do some examples with some 2-5-1 lines. Okay, so the first line sounds like this. what is there to say about that? Well, I mean, I am actually starting the line with sort of a chromatic enclosure of leading notes, or not chromatic, but some leading notes for the root of the D minor 7. That's a fairly straightforward D minor 7 line, I think. The line on the alto dominant is sort of a sequenced idea of the consisting of an A flat minor triad and the F diminished triad. Okay, the second example. Well, the line on the D minor 7 is a stack of fours, kind of like what I talked about in the lesson last time. And the line on the G7 altered is pretty scale based, so that's not really too much to say about that, except of course the whole thing with most of the time when you come across these sort of trills, this is sort of a very normal way to do that. So if you you might want to check that out, because if you're playing sort of Parker themes and stuff like that, this is a useful thing to be able to do. And exactly that way of playing it is usually the one that sounds the best. At least that's what I find. Okay, so the third example. Which sounds a bit more spacey, I guess. So what's going on with that? Well, I think that's a pretty straightforward D minor line. On the G7, I'm actually using two other arpeggios than what I talked about in the first here above, in the example 5 is that. I'm using, which is in fact a D flat 7, which is the tritone of the G7. The altered sound and the tritone substitution sound are very related, so it's not so strange that that arpeggio will work well in this context. So I'm playing that, and then I'm playing this, which is actually a drop 2 voicing of an A flat minor major 7 with a 9. And then I'm resolving that to G. So it's a combination of D flat 7 and A flat minor major and C major. So that was 3 examples of lines with alto dominance. And a short description on how I view the alto scale and how I think about it when I'm practicing or when I'm composing. Of course, you need to work on this so much that you don't really have to worry about that note resolves to that note. That has to be part of your system. And probably the way to do that is just by making enough lines and practicing enough and getting them into your system in that way, and hearing that, having stuff in your fingers and your ears especially, of course. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope that you can use the stuff that I covered here. If you have any comments or any requests for lessons on certain topics, then connect with me on Google+, Facebook, Twitter. Let me know there, or leave a comment here in the video. If you like the video, then well, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Of course, if you want to help me, feel free to share it on social media, And thank you for watching.